In the quiet plains of rural Texas, Frank Mitchell, an elderly rancher, had lived a peaceful life with Kodiak, the massive bear he raised from a cub. But peace is fleeting. When the Mexican cartel sets their sights on his land, they assume Frank is an easy target. They see an old man with no allies and a bear they believe can be used against him. However, Frank has one rule: never back down. And when the cartel pushes him too far, they unleash a counterforce they could never have anticipated. Old friends with a deadly resolve. What follows is a battle for survival and legacy, with twists no one sees coming. The sun was setting over Mitchell Ranch, painting the sky in hues of orange and red. Frank Mitchell stood at the edge of the pasture, resting a hand on the old wooden fence. Kodiak, the massive brown bear he had raised since its mother was killed by poachers, ambled nearby. The bear grunted softly, as if sensing the tension in the air. Frank sighed and looked toward the horizon. The ranch had been in his family for 3 generations. Now, he was the last Mitchell left, holding onto a legacy that felt more fragile with each passing year. But that wasn't the only weight on his mind. Strange vehicles had been seen driving past the property lately, black SUVs with dark windows. He knew trouble was coming. He could feel it in his bones. Inside the house, Frank poured himself a cup of coffee and turned on the radio. The familiar sounds of country music filled the room. As he sat down at the kitchen table, Kodiak pushed his large head against the window, watching him. "Don't worry, buddy," Frank muttered. "We'll handle whatever's coming." His peace was interrupted by the sound of tires crunching gravel outside. Frank stood and moved to the front porch, where 2 black SUVs had pulled up near the gate. 4 men stepped out, each armed, their eyes scanning the property. One of the men, who had a long scar across his jaw, approached the gate and gave a mocking smile. "Evening, Mr. Mitchell. Beautiful place you've got here." Frank said nothing, his gaze steady. "Name's Javier," the man continued. "My friends and I work with an organization that's interested in this land. We think it's valuable. Problem is, you're in the way." Frank crossed his arms. "This land isn't for sale. And if you know what's good for you, you'll turn those trucks around and leave." Javier chuckled. "I don't think you understand. We're not asking. You can either cooperate, or things might get difficult." Kodiak let out a low growl from behind the fence. The men stiffened, their hands moving instinctively to their weapons. "You hear that?" Frank asked, his voice cold. "That's a bear that doesn't like uninvited guests. You think a pet bear scares us?" Javier sneered. "We'll be back, and when we return, that animal won't be your problem anymore." With that, the cartel men returned to their vehicles and drove off, leaving a trail of dust in their wake. Frank stood in silence for a moment, his mind racing. The threat was real, and he couldn't face it alone. Later that night, while Frank was patrolling the property, a commotion broke out near the southern fence. By the time he reached the area, he found an empty clearing, and Kodiak was gone. A large steel cage sat in the distance, its doors slammed shut and tire tracks leading away from the scene. The cartel had taken his bear. "Those bastards," Frank whispered, fury building inside him. Frank didn't waste any time. He walked back to the house, picked up the phone, and dialed a number he hadn't used in years. "Danny, it's Frank," he said when the line connected. "Frank? Damn, it's been a while. What's going on?" "I've got a problem," Frank replied. "The cartel took Kodiak. They want my land. I need your help." There was a pause on the other end before Danny spoke again. "Say no more. We'll be there by morning." Frank hung up and looked out at the empty yard. The calm was gone. The storm had begun, and he knew that by the time it ended, nothing would ever be the same. The next morning, the roar of motorcycles echoed across the plains. Danny and a dozen members of his biker gang rolled into the ranch. They were all veterans, men who had fought in wars and now lived by their own code. Danny dismounted and gave Frank a firm handshake. "You're sure about this? You know what happens if we go up against the cartel?" "They came after my family," Frank said. "I won't let them take anything else." Danny nodded. "Then let's give them a fight they'll never forget." Together, they began preparing the ranch for battle. Traps were set, vantage points secured, and defenses reinforced. By the time the cartel returned, they would be walking straight into a trap. The air was thick with anticipation as Frank and the bikers fortified the ranch. Danny's men worked quickly and efficiently, setting up ambush points along the property's main access routes. They laid spike strips along the gravel road leading to the house and rigged explosive traps near the fences. Frank walked the perimeter with Danny, their boots crunching softly on the dirt. "I appreciate you coming all this way," Frank said quietly. "You saved my life back in Fallujah," Danny replied without missing a beat. "This is the least I can do." Frank grunted in acknowledgement. Both men had seen their fair share of battle, but this time it was different. They weren't just defending a patch of land. They were protecting their legacy and lives. Inside the barn, one of Danny's men, a wiry mechanic named Travis, was setting up surveillance equipment. He adjusted a drone controller and grinned. "Got a couple of eyes in the sky now. We'll see them coming from miles away." Joanna, one of Danny's younger recruits, approached Frank with a curious look. "So, this bear of yours, is he really trained?" Frank nodded. "Kodiak's more than just a bear. He's family, and he's smart enough to know who the real threats are." "You think he's still alive?" she asked. Frank's jaw tightened. "He's alive, and I'm going to get him back." Later that night, Travis's drone feed suddenly buzzed with activity. "We've got movement," he said, his eyes narrowing at the screen. Danny and Frank crowded around the monitor. Several vehicles were approaching the ranch, more cartel SUVs, this time accompanied by a large transport truck. "They're coming in hot," Danny muttered. Frank's eyes hardened. "They've got Kodiak with them. I can feel it." "Then it's game time," Danny said, signaling to his men. "Positions." The bikers moved quickly, taking up defensive positions around the ranch. Frank grabbed his shotgun and took cover behind a stone wall near the front gate. The roar of engines grew louder until the cartel convoy came into view. The lead SUV skidded to a halt near the gate, and Javier stepped out, flanked by heavily armed men. "Mitchell," Javier shouted. "We know you've been busy. You've got friends now, but it won't matter. Give us the land, or you'll lose everything." Frank stepped into view, his shotgun resting casually on his shoulder. "You made a mistake coming back here," he said calmly. Javier sneered. "You're an old man trying to play hero. Let's see how far that gets you." He raised his hand, signaling his men to advance. The cartel soldiers moved toward the gate, unaware of the traps waiting for them. As soon as they crossed the threshold, a hidden explosive detonated, sending debris and shrapnel into the air. Several cartel men were thrown off their feet, and the others scrambled for cover. "Open fire," Danny shouted. Gunfire erupted from the bikers' positions. The cartel convoy was pinned down, their vehicles becoming makeshift barricades. Frank fired a warning shot that shattered the windshield of one of the trucks. "You've got one chance to walk away," Frank yelled over the gunfire. Javier, crouching behind a damaged SUV, cursed under his breath. "Damn it, they were ready for us." Another explosion rocked the area as Maddox, one of Danny's men, detonated a spike trap under the second vehicle. The tires blew out, leaving the truck immobile. "Looks like your plan's falling apart," Danny called out, his voice taunting. Javier's face twisted in fury. "Fall back. Regroup," he ordered his men. The remaining cartel soldiers retreated under heavy fire, disappearing into the darkness. As silence fell over the ranch, Frank and Danny stepped out from their cover. "That went smoother than expected," Danny said, lowering his weapon. "Too smooth," Frank replied warily. "This isn't over." As the bikers regrouped to assess the damage, a deep, echoing roar cut through the night air. Frank's eyes widened. "That's him," he whispered. "That's Kodiak." Joanna looked around nervously. "It's coming from the woods." "Let's go," Frank said, already moving toward the sound. Danny and a few others followed, their weapons at the ready. They reached the edge of the property, where a large crate lay overturned near the tree line. The door to the crate had been forced open, claw marks gouged deep into the wood. Tracks led away from the site, disappearing into the dense underbrush. "He escaped," Frank said, a hint of relief in his voice. "He's out there somewhere." "We'll find him," Danny assured him. "But we've got bigger problems. The cartel's not going to let this go." Frank nodded. "Let them come. This time, they'll get more than they bargained for. The battle for the ranch was far from over, and Frank knew that the next confrontation would be even deadlier. But with Kodiak free and his allies standing beside him, he was ready to face whatever came next. The night was still, the faint sound of crickets in the distance broken only by the occasional rustle of leaves. Frank and Danny stood near the edge of the woods, their flashlights cutting through the darkness. Kodiak had escaped, but where he had gone and whether the cartel might try to capture him again remained a pressing concern. Danny crouched beside the overturned crate, running his hand over the deep claw marks. "He's a big boy, isn't he?" Frank chuckled softly. "Bigger than they expected. Kodiak knows how to take care of himself, but I don't want him caught out there alone. If they find him first—" Danny stood and nodded. "We'll sweep the area. Let's bring him home before the cartel does." As the group prepared to split into search teams, a low growl echoed through the trees. Everyone froze. Slowly, Frank raised his hand, signaling for silence. "That's him," Frank whispered. The growl grew closer, followed by heavy footsteps crunching through the underbrush. Moments later, Kodiak emerged from the shadows, his massive form towering over the group. His eyes gleamed in the dim light, but he was calm, recognizing Frank immediately. "Kodiak," Frank called gently. The bear huffed in response and lumbered toward him. Danny and the others stepped back instinctively. "That's a lot of bear," Travis muttered, his eyes wide. Frank walked up to Kodiak and placed a hand on the bear's thick fur. "You did good, boy. You found your way back." Kodiak grunted softly, nuzzling Frank's shoulder. It was a rare moment of peace, but Frank knew it wouldn't last. "They're going to come after him again," Frank said. "We need to be ready." The group returned to the ranch with Kodiak in tow. By dawn, everyone was busy reinforcing the defenses and preparing for what they knew would be a larger assault. Kodiak roamed the perimeter, his presence alone enough to intimidate anyone watching from afar. Meanwhile, in a secluded warehouse several miles away, Javier paced angrily. His pride was wounded, and his superiors were demanding answers. "We underestimated them," one of his lieutenants said. "They've got help, veterans, bikers, and that damn bear." Javier slammed his fist onto the table. "I don't care if they have an army. We're finishing this. I want every man we have ready to move by nightfall. No more games. We'll hit them with everything." Another man, a cartel strategist named Ortega, leaned forward. "We should isolate Mitchell first. Use his bear against him. If we can cut him off from his allies, we can break him." "And how do you plan on controlling a bear?" Javier asked, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "We don't control it. We manipulate the situation," Ortega explained. "Draw the bear away from the ranch. Force Mitchell to choose between defending his land or rescuing his pet." Javier considered the plan, a slow grin forming on his face. "Fine, let's lure the bear out. But once Mitchell's vulnerable, we crush him and his little gang." Back at the ranch, Frank and Danny met near the barn to review their plans. "They'll be back tonight," Danny said. "You sure you don't want to get the sheriff involved?" "The sheriff can't handle this," Frank replied. "This isn't just about land anymore. It's about sending a message. If we don't stop them here, they'll do the same to every other ranch in the region." "Then we fight," Danny said, clapping Frank on the shoulder. Joanna approached, carrying a radio. "We've got drone footage. Looks like movement near the ridge. They're scouting us again." "Let them watch," Frank said. "By the time they get here, they won't know what hit them." That evening, Kodiak became restless, pacing along the perimeter fence. Frank noticed the bear's agitation and followed him. "What is it, boy?" Frank murmured. Kodiak growled softly, his ears twitching as if hearing something in the distance. Moments later, Travis called out from the surveillance station. "We've got activity. Looks like they're trying to draw us out." "Looks like they're playing smart this time," Danny muttered. Frank clenched his jaw. "They're targeting Kodiak. They think if they get him out in the open, they can divide us." "Then what's the play?" Joanna asked. "We don't take the bait," Frank said firmly, "but we'll make them think we are." Frank and Danny devised a plan to use the cartel's own tactics against them. They set up a decoy operation, making it appear as though Kodiak was being escorted to a different location. Using a modified truck and sound recordings of the bear's growls, they led the cartel scouts on a wild goose chase. Meanwhile, the real Kodiak stayed hidden near the main ranch house, ready to defend his territory if needed. "We're luring them into a trap of our own," Frank said. "When they come for the bear, they'll walk straight into an ambush." The stage was set. The cartel believed they had the upper hand, but Frank and his allies were about to show them just how wrong they were. Nightfall blanketed the ranch in darkness. The air was cold and still, heavy with the tension of an impending battle. Frank and Danny stood near the main house, going over the final details of their plan. They had spent the last several hours making the ranch appear vulnerable, while their decoy convoy led the cartel's scouts further away. The bikers and Kodiak were hidden in strategic positions around the property. "This is it," Danny said, adjusting his gear. "We've set every trap we can think of. Now we just wait for them to make their move." "They'll come," Frank replied, his voice calm and steady. "They think they're in control. Tonight, we remind them who really owns this land." Kodiak let out a low growl from his hiding spot near the barn. He could sense something was coming. Shortly after midnight, the first sign of the enemy appeared on the surveillance monitors. Travis whispered into the radio, "Multiple vehicles approaching from the west. They're coming in low, trying to avoid detection." "Stay in position," Frank ordered. "Let them get close." The cartel convoy slowed as it reached the perimeter. Javier, leading the attack, signaled for his men to fan out. They moved silently, rifles at the ready, scanning for signs of movement. They expected resistance but had no idea they were walking into a carefully orchestrated trap. "They think we don't see them," Danny whispered. "Good," Frank replied. "Let them feel safe." As the cartel soldiers breached the outer fence, the first trap activated. An explosive hidden near the gate detonated, sending a shockwave across the property. 2 cartel men were thrown to the ground, and the others scrambled for cover. "Go loud," Danny shouted. Gunfire erupted from the bikers' positions. The attackers found themselves pinned down, their vehicles quickly becoming useless as more traps triggered. Spike strips shredded tires, and smoke grenades obscured their vision. Javier cursed as he ducked behind a boulder. "They were ready for us again. Fall back and regroup." Just as the cartel tried to reorganize, a deep, guttural roar echoed across the ranch. Kodiak charged out from behind the barn, his massive frame illuminated by the moonlight. The sight of the bear charging directly at them caused several cartel soldiers to panic. "Bear! Bear!" one of them screamed, dropping his weapon as he fled. Kodiak barreled through the chaos, scattering the attackers. He knocked over a cartel enforcer who had been aiming at Danny, sending the man flying several feet. "That's one hell of a backup," Danny muttered as he fired another shot at a retreating enemy. The cartel's formation broke apart as fear took hold. Javier shouted in frustration, "Stand your ground! It's just an animal." But it was too late. The sight of Kodiak, combined with the relentless fire from Frank's allies, had shattered their morale. Realizing the attack was failing, Javier decided to make a desperate move. He barked orders into his radio. "Pull back. We'll regroup at the ridge and hit them from the east." Frank overheard the command through the surveillance feed. "They're trying to reposition. We can't let them get a foothold on the ridge." "Leave that to me," Danny said. He signaled a group of bikers to follow him toward the eastern side of the property. Frank nodded. "Keep them on the run. I'll handle things here." As Danny and his men moved to intercept the cartel reinforcements, Travis picked up something unusual on the drone feed. Frank, we've got a problem." "What is it?" Frank asked, his tone tense. "One of the cartel trucks split off from the main group. It's circling back toward the house. I think they're trying to flank you." Frank's eyes narrowed. They're desperate. They know they can't win a straight fight. He turned to Joanna, who was stationed near the front porch. "They're coming for the house. Stay sharp." Moments later, the truck burst through a section of the fence, skidding to a halt near the driveway. Several cartel soldiers jumped out, weapons drawn. "Get inside," Frank yelled. Joanna fired a shot, hitting one of the attackers as she retreated into the house. The firefight intensified as Frank and Joanna defended the house. Kodiak, sensing the danger, roared and charged toward the new attackers. One of the cartel soldiers hesitated for a moment too long, and the bear's sheer presence caused him to retreat in terror. "Fall back to the barn," Frank shouted. He and Joanna moved quickly, using the ranch's layout to their advantage. The attackers were disoriented, their communication breaking down under the pressure. Danny's group caught up with the cartel soldiers, attempting to regroup at the ridge. The bikers launched a surprise assault, cutting off their escape route. Caught between two fronts, the remaining cartel forces had no choice but to surrender or flee. "Throw down your weapons," Danny yelled. One by one, the cartel soldiers dropped their rifles. Javier, realizing he had been defeated, glared at Frank from across the field. "This isn't over," he growled before being tackled to the ground by Maddox. Frank approached slowly, his shotgun lowered but ready. "You came after my land, my bear, and my family. Now you're going to answer for it." As dawn broke over the ranch, the remaining cartel members were rounded up. Local authorities, tipped off by Danny's contacts, arrived to take the prisoners into custody. The ranch was battered but standing strong, and Kodiak stood proudly beside Frank, his presence a reminder of the power of loyalty and resilience. Danny walked over to Frank and clapped him on the shoulder. "You did it, old man. You held the line." Frank gave a small smile. "We all did." But deep down, he knew this wasn't the end. The cartel would send others. They always did. "Let them come," Frank muttered under his breath. "We'll be ready." The ranch was quiet again, though the scars of the battle remained. Smoke from the destroyed cartel vehicles drifted into the morning sky. Bullet holes peppered the fences and walls of the property, and patches of dirt were torn up by explosions. Despite the damage, Frank Mitchell stood tall near the barn, surveying the aftermath. Kodiak lay beside him, his ears perked and alert, as if still sensing danger. Danny approached, wiping soot off his hands. "Most of their guys are in custody. The sheriff's boys are hauling them off now. You'd think that'd be the end of it." Frank nodded, but didn't look reassured. "It's not over. You heard what Javier said. Someone higher up is going to come looking for payback. This fight's only just started." Danny folded his arms. "So, what's the plan, Frank? We wait for them to make the next move, or do we take the fight to them?" Before Frank could answer, Joanna walked up, holding a confiscated radio from one of the cartel trucks. "You need to hear this," she said, handing it to Frank. A voice crackled through the static, deep and deliberate. "Javier, you failed. As expected. We are already en route to correct your mistakes. Mitchell will not hold that land much longer." Frank frowned and tightened his grip on the radio. "They've already got reinforcements coming." Danny scowled. "How fast do you think they'll get here?" "Fast enough," Joanna replied. "If they know we've captured their men, they'll move quickly to prevent them from talking." Frank nodded grimly. "Then we don't have much time. We need to cut off their supply chain and cripple their ability to strike back." Danny glanced over at Travis, who was sorting through some documents they had found in one of the cartel vehicles. "You find anything useful in those files?" Travis nodded excitedly. "Yeah. Looks like they were using a remote compound near the southern border as a staging ground. They've got supply routes mapped out and everything. If we hit that compound, we could choke off their entire operation in this area." Frank's eyes narrowed. "That's where we need to go." Joanna stepped forward. "You can't do this alone, Frank. You're going to need all of us to pull this off." "I wasn't planning to go alone," Frank replied. "We'll strike before they have a chance to regroup. If we take out their base, they'll have no choice but to back off." Danny smiled grimly. "Looks like we're going on the offensive." The bikers regrouped at the ranch to finalize their plans. Maddox laid out a map of the surrounding region on a work table. "The compound is about 40 miles from here," he explained. "Heavily guarded, but if we hit them hard and fast, we can catch them off guard." "Any word on who's running the operation there?" Danny asked. "Nothing concrete," Maddox replied. "But if that radio message was anything to go by, it's someone who doesn't tolerate failure." Frank nodded. "Then we take out their leader. We cut the head off the snake." Joanna spoke up. "We'll need to stay mobile. Once they realize we're coming, they'll try to surround us. We'll split into 2 teams, Danny suggested. One to create a diversion at the main gate, and the other to hit the supply depot from the back. That should throw them into disarray. As the group finished their preparations, one of the captured cartel men suddenly shouted from where he was being held near the barn. "You think you've got everything figured out, huh? You have no idea who you're dealing with." Frank approached him slowly, his eyes cold. "Then why don't you enlighten me?" The man smirked. "You've got someone feeding you false information. That compound? It's a trap. They knew you'd find those documents." Frank narrowed his eyes but didn't show any fear. "If it's a trap, that means they're expecting us. Which also means they'll have their best men there." "Exactly," the man sneered. "You walk into that compound, and none of you are coming out alive." Frank turned and walked away without another word. Joanna caught up with him. "You believe him?" "Doesn't matter," Frank replied. "Trap or not, we don't have a choice. We either hit them now or wait for them to bring the fight back here. I'd rather face them on our terms." As the group prepared to move out, Travis called out in alarm. "Frank, we've got a problem." He held up a small device he had found hidden under one of the captured cartel trucks. It was a GPS tracker, and it was active. "They've been tracking us this whole time," Travis explained. "They probably already know we're planning to leave the ranch." Danny swore under his breath. "So much for the element of surprise." "We can still use this to our advantage," Frank said after a moment of thought. "We'll leave the tracker here and make them think we're staying put. Meanwhile, we'll head out through the back roads and hit the compound before they can react." Joanna nodded in agreement. "Smart. We keep them guessing." The group moved quickly, loading up their vehicles and heading out under the cover of darkness. Kodiak followed close behind, his presence both a comfort and a warning of the battle ahead. "This is it," Frank said quietly as they drove toward the compound. "No turning back now." Danny glanced at him from the driver's seat. "We've been through worse, old man. Let's finish this." Frank nodded. The time for defense was over. Now, it was their turn to strike. The convoy of trucks and motorcycles moved quietly through the back roads under a moonlit sky. The chill of the night air brushed against their skin as Frank, Danny, and the rest of the team advanced toward the cartel's compound deep in the desert. They had avoided the main highways to stay off the radar and mislead any scouts the cartel might have sent. Every man and woman in the group knew what was at stake. Frank rode in the lead truck beside Danny, keeping his eyes on the horizon. Kodiak was secured in a modified trailer in the back, pacing restlessly as if sensing the danger ahead. Danny broke the silence. "You ever think we'd be back in a situation like this? Feels like old times, huh?" Frank gave a faint smile. "Old times didn't involve a damn bear." Danny chuckled. "Fair point. But it's good to know he's got our backs." "Let's just hope we make it through this in one piece," Frank replied. As they neared the compound, Travis's drone feed displayed thermal signatures on a monitor inside the truck. "We've got movement up ahead," he reported. "Looks like a sentry post about half a mile from the main gate. 2 guards, possibly more nearby." "We take them out quietly," Frank said. "No alerts." Danny nodded and signaled to Maddox and Joanna, who peeled off on their motorcycles to flank the sentry post. Within minutes, silenced shots rang out, and the guards dropped without raising the alarm. "Clear," Maddox reported. The convoy continued forward, moving closer to the compound's perimeter. The tension in the air thickened as they approached the final stretch. The compound came into view, an industrial facility surrounded by high fences and floodlights. Trucks and storage containers were scattered across the yard, and armed guards patrolled in pairs. The bikers parked their vehicles in a concealed position behind a ridge, using the terrain to stay hidden. Frank and Danny gathered the group for a final briefing. "Remember the plan," Danny said. "Team 1 creates a diversion at the main gate. Team 2 hits the supply depot from the east. We take out their communications and supplies first. Then we cut off their escape." Frank stepped forward. "This is going to get messy. Stick together, watch your corners, and don't let them regroup. We hit them hard and fast." "Let's do this," Joanna said, cocking her rifle. Team 1, led by Danny and Maddox, advanced toward the main gate under the cover of darkness. They planted explosives on the gate's hinges and waited for the signal. Meanwhile, Frank, Joanna, and Travis moved toward the eastern side of the compound, where the supply depot was located. Frank felt the weight of each step as they crept through the shadows. He knew the cartel might be expecting them, but they couldn't turn back now. Kara's voice came through their earpieces. I've hacked into their camera system. You've got about 5 minutes before a patrol comes your way. Move fast. Copy that, Frank whispered. Joanna and Travis took position near a cluster of shipping containers. Frank moved ahead, peeking around the corner to get a view of the depot. What he saw made his stomach drop. The area was empty, too empty. There were no guards, no workers, and no visible supplies. It was as if the compound had been evacuated in anticipation of their attack. It's a trap, Frank muttered. Before he could warn the others, floodlights snapped on, blinding them. Gunfire erupted from elevated positions as cartel soldiers opened fire from hidden vantage points. Ambush! Joanna yelled, diving behind cover. Danny's voice came over the radio. They've got us pinned at the gate too. It's a damn setup. Frank gritted his teeth. Hold your positions. We push through this. Back at the staging area, Kodiak sensed the danger and began to thrash inside the trailer. The bikers guarding the convoy struggled to keep him contained. We can't hold him, one of them shouted as the bear roared and smashed through the reinforced walls of the trailer. Kodiak charged toward the compound, driven by instinct to protect his territory and the people he trusted. He crashed through the eastern fence, sending guards scrambling in panic. Looks like we've got reinforcements, Travis said with a grin as the bear tore into the nearest group of attackers. The sight of Kodiak sowed chaos among the cartel soldiers. Some fled in terror, while others hesitated, giving Frank's team the opening they needed. Let's move, Frank shouted, leading the charge. As the battle raged, Frank caught sight of a familiar figure near the compound's central tower. It was Ortega, the cartel strategist who had orchestrated the trap. He stood calmly, issuing orders to his men through a radio. Frank clenched his jaw. That's the bastard calling the shots. I'll take him out, Joanna said, raising her rifle. No, Frank replied. I'm handling this. With Kodiak providing cover, Frank made his way toward the tower. He moved swiftly through the chaos, taking out cartel soldiers one by one. When he finally reached Ortega, the man showed no fear. So, you're the one causing all this trouble, Ortega said, his voice cold and detached. You came after my family, Frank growled. You made this personal. Personal? Ortega chuckled. You're just a pawn in a much bigger game. Killing me won't stop what's coming. Maybe not, Frank said, stepping closer. But it's a damn good start. Before Ortega could react, Frank delivered a swift blow that knocked him unconscious. He grabbed the man's radio and barked into it. Stand down or you're next. The remaining cartel soldiers hesitated, their morale shattered. One by one, they dropped their weapons and surrendered. With Ortega captured and the compound in ruins, the battle was over. Danny and his team regrouped near the supply depot, exhausted but victorious. We did it, Danny said, clapping Frank on the shoulder. We took them down. Frank nodded, his eyes scanning the destruction. This was just one part of their operation. We've sent a message, but they'll come back if we're not ready. Joanna approached, wiping dirt from her face. Then we make sure they can't. As dawn broke, Kodiak stood beside Frank, surveying the battlefield like a guardian. The fight wasn't over, but for now, they had one. We're not just defending a ranch anymore, Frank said quietly. We're defending a future. Danny smiled. And they'll know better than to mess with us again. The morning sun rose over the compound, casting long shadows across the ruins. The once imposing facility lay in shambles. Smoking trucks, fallen guards, and destroyed infrastructure told the story of a decisive victory. But Frank knew better than to celebrate. This wasn't the end. Ortega's warning still echoed in his mind. You're just a pawn in a much bigger game. Danny wiped sweat from his brow as he approached Frank near the central tower. Ortega, unconscious and restrained, lay on the ground. Danny nudged him with his boot. What do you think? Should we start squeezing this guy for information? Frank shook his head. Not here. We've sent a message, but it's only a matter of time before someone else comes looking. We need to fall back to the ranch and regroup. The longer we stay, the bigger the target on our backs. Danny nodded. Agreed. Let's pack up and get out of here. As the team prepared to leave, Kara's voice crackled over the radio. Frank, we've got a situation. I intercepted a coded transmission from a satellite uplink connected to the compound. What's it say? Frank asked. It's a distress call, Kara replied. They're sending reinforcements, a specialized strike team. ETA is about 3 hours. Danny let out a low whistle. They're moving fast. Frank cursed under his breath. They won't let this loss go unanswered. Get everyone ready to roll out. We're not sticking around for their cleanup crew. Joanna ran up, her face tense. The prisoners are secure, but if they're bringing in elite reinforcements, we need to move now. Frank nodded. We take Ortega with us. He's our bargaining chip. The convoy left the compound, moving quickly through the desert back roads. Travis piloted a drone overhead to keep an eye on any approaching threats. Kodiak rode in the modified trailer, calm but watchful. Ortega was restrained in the lead truck, seated between Frank and Danny. You've lost, Frank told him as they drove. Your men are dead, your base is gone, and your supplies are gone. No one's coming to save you. Ortega smirked despite his situation. You really think this is over? You don't know who you're dealing with. The people funding this operation, they have deep pockets. They won't stop until you're buried. We'll see about that, Frank replied, gripping the wheel tighter. Just as the convoy crossed a dry riverbed, Travis's drone feed showed movement. Guys? We've got company. Multiple vehicles inbound, moving fast. How many? Danny asked. At least 5 SUVs, Travis reported. They've got heavy machine guns mounted on 2 of them. Frank exchanged a look with Danny. They're coming for Ortega. The cartel convoy closed the distance quickly. Dust clouds rose in the distance as engines roared behind them. Maddox's voice came through the radio. We've got to shake them. There's a narrow pass coming up a few miles ahead. If we can reach it, we can funnel them into a choke point. Let's move, Danny said. Everyone, keep your eyes sharp. They'll try to flank us. Gunfire erupted from the pursuing vehicles. Bullets pinged off the rear trucks as Kodiak growled from inside his trailer. That bear's about to lose his patience, Joanna muttered as she returned fire from the back of her truck. We can use that, Frank said with a grim smile. As the convoy reached the narrow pass, Frank made a decision. Let Kodiak out. He'll know what to do. Danny raised an eyebrow. You sure about that? Trust me, Frank replied. Joanna quickly unlocked the trailer's rear gate. Kodiak roared as he leapt out, landing with a thundering impact on the dirt road. The cartel drivers hesitated for a split second, long enough for Kodiak to charge at the lead SUV. With one swipe of his massive paw, he shattered the vehicle's windshield and forced it off the road. That'll slow them down, Danny said with a grin. The convoy pressed forward, but something wasn't right. Travis's drone feed showed one of their own trucks slowing down. Hey, why's truck 3 falling behind? Travis asked. Before anyone could answer, the truck veered sharply and blocked the road, cutting off the rest of the convoy. It's an ambush, Joanna shouted. A man inside the truck, one of their supposed allies, stepped out with a radio. You thought you could win, Mitchell? You thought we wouldn't have someone on the inside? Frank's eyes widened in shock. You're working for them? The man sneered. You've been in over your head since the beginning. Gunfire erupted again as more cartel vehicles surrounded the convoy from both sides. The betrayal had turned the situation from bad to worse. Danny grabbed his rifle. We need to break through. Maddox, take out that traitor's truck. Maddox nodded and fired a grenade launcher, obliterating the blockade. Kodiak, still in full combat mode, roared and charged at the remaining cartel soldiers, scattering them in panic. Frank and Danny pushed forward, leading the convoy out of the pass. Joanna provided cover fire, taking out cartel gunners from the ridge. One by one, the cartel vehicles were disabled or forced to retreat. When the dust finally settled, the convoy had escaped the ambush. Ortega sat silently in the truck, his expression unreadable. You didn't see that coming, did you? Frank asked him coldly. For the first time, Ortega showed a flicker of uncertainty. You're more resourceful than I gave you credit for, he admitted. But this isn't over. The people backing me, They'll keep coming. Let them, Frank said. We'll be ready. The team regrouped near an abandoned outpost to catch their breath. The fight had been brutal, but they had survived. Now, it was time to finish what they started. The team regrouped at an old abandoned outpost deep in the desert, far from any main roads. Frank, Danny, and Joanna assessed their injuries and equipment. The ambush had cost them time and resources, but they had survived. Kodiak paced restlessly near the trucks, his senses still heightened from the battle. Joanna reloaded her rifle, her jaw tight. We're running on fumes here. We can't keep up like this if they hit us again. Danny leaned against the hood of a truck, wiping sweat from his brow. She's right, Frank. We need to either disappear or take the fight to them for good. They've got the manpower to chase us across the entire region if we keep running. Frank nodded slowly, his mind racing through options. We don't have time to wait. They're going to regroup, and when they do, it'll be worse. We need to make them believe this was the end of the line for us. Inside the truck, Ortega sat restrained but eerily calm. He watched the group with a cold expression, waiting for his moment. When Frank entered the vehicle, Ortega grinned. You're making a mistake, Ortega said softly. You think you've won a few battles, but you haven't seen what's really coming. The people who fund this operation, they've built empires across entire countries. They can make you vanish without a trace. Frank leaned in close, his voice a low growl. That's funny. I thought your empire was lying in ruins back there at the compound. Ortega's smirk faltered, but he quickly recovered. You've disrupted one operation. That's all. You think taking me out will change anything? You'll only bring more heat down on you. Frank's eyes narrowed. Maybe, but right now, you're not the one holding the cards. Ortega's bluff was unraveling, but Frank knew there was truth to his words. The cartel's network stretched far beyond this region. The fight wasn't just about one compound or one group of soldiers. Kara's voice suddenly interrupted through the radio. Frank, you're not going to believe this. I intercepted another transmission. Someone's trying to reach Ortega on a secure line. Patch it through, Frank said. Moments later, a voice came through the speaker. It was deep, authoritative, and calm. Ortega, I trust you're still alive. If you're hearing this, you've failed. But I'm giving you one chance to correct your mistake. Do not let Mitchell escape again. The line went silent. Ortega chuckled softly. See? Even they know what's coming next. You can't outrun this forever. Frank ignored the taunt and turned to Danny. They're making their next move. We need to get ahead of them. The team gathered around a makeshift map spread out on the hood of one of the trucks. Joanna traced a route toward an old cartel safe house near the border. This location used to be one of their major hubs, she explained. If we hit it, we can disrupt their backup resources and force their leaders into the open. They won't have time to organize a proper counterattack. It's risky, Maddox said, shaking his head. We've got limited ammo, no reinforcements, and Ortega's people know these routes better than we do. Frank crossed his arms. It's risky, but it's our best shot. We take out their safe house, cripple their supply line, and draw out whoever's really calling the shots. Danny smirked. Hell, I like those odds. Let's do it. As the group prepared to leave, one of the bikers, Marcus, stepped forward hesitantly. Hey, Frank. I've got a contact who might be able to help. Ex-military guy who used to work undercover in these parts. He's got intel on the cartel's movements. Frank raised an eyebrow. And you waited until now to tell us? Marcus shrugged. Didn't think we'd need him until now. He's not exactly the friendliest type, but if anyone knows how to disrupt their network, it's him. Fine, Frank said. Get him on the line. Marcus made a quick call, and within minutes, they had a new lead. The contact, a man named Reyes, agreed to meet them at a neutral location near the border. Reyes knows the terrain better than anyone, Marcus explained. If he's on board, we've got a real shot at pulling this off. As the convoy headed toward the meeting point, Kara's voice returned with an urgent warning. Frank, you've got drones in the sky. They're tracking your position. I'm doing what I can to jam their signals, but they're closing in fast. How close? Frank asked. Too close, Kara replied. They'll be on you within 15 minutes unless you shake them. Danny cursed. They're not giving us a break, are they? Keep driving, Frank ordered. Kara, jam everything you can. We'll handle the rest. The bikers accelerated, weaving through back roads and rough terrain. Kodiak roared from the back, sensing the tension in the air. The team knew that time was running out. After an intense chase, the convoy finally reached an isolated canyon where Reyes was waiting. He was a tall, rugged man with a hardened gaze. He stepped forward as the convoy pulled to a stop. Mitchell, Reyes said, extending a hand. You've stirred up quite the hornet's nest. Just doing what needs to be done, Frank replied, shaking his hand. Reyes nodded. You want to take out their safe house? I can help with that. But once you cross that line, there's no going back. The people funding this operation, they'll make you a permanent enemy. We crossed that line a long time ago, Danny said with a smirk. Good, Reyes replied. Then let's end this. The team finalized their plan with Reyes's help. They would launch an all-out assault on the cartel's safe house, cutting off their last major support line. The time for defense was over. Now, it was about survival and revenge. We finished this tonight, Frank said. No more running. With their path set and their allies ready, they prepared for the final battle. The night sky was clear, stars scattered like shattered glass over the desert as Frank's convoy crept closer to the cartel's safe house. The facility was tucked between rocky hills near the border, fortified with high fences, guard towers, and armed patrols. Bright floodlights scanned the area, making it nearly impossible to approach unseen. From their vantage point on a ridge, Frank and Reyes studied the compound through binoculars. Reyes pointed toward a narrow access road flanked by cliffs. That's their weak spot. A heavy convoy can't get through without bottlenecking. We can trap them there if we play this right. Danny crouched beside them, observing the patrol patterns. How many men do you think they've got inside? Too many, Reyes muttered. But numbers don't mean much if we cut their comms and supplies. Hit them fast, take out the towers, and they'll be scrambling. Good, Frank said, lowering the binoculars. Let's stick to the plan. Team 1 handles the diversion at the main gate. Team 2 will breach the side entrance and disable their communication center. Reyes nodded. Once we take that comms tower down, it's game over for them. As the teams prepared to move out, a familiar voice came through the radio unexpectedly. Javier's voice, filled with desperation. Whoever's listening, this is Javier. I'm done with these people. They left me out here to die. I can help you take down Ortega's bosses if you give me protection. Frank exchanged a skeptical glance with Danny. You trust him? No, Danny said flatly. But if he's desperate enough to turn on his own, we might be able to use him. Frank thought for a moment, then replied into the radio. You get one chance, Javier. You guide us through the compound without double-crossing us, and we'll talk about protection. But if you try anything— I get it, Javier interrupted. You'll kill me. Just tell me where to meet. Reyes shook his head. He's a snake, Frank. Watch your back. We'll handle him, Frank replied. Let's move. The convoy approached the compound from two directions. Danny led Team 1 toward the front gate, planting explosives on key access points. Frank, Joanna, and Reyes led Team 2 around the side, where a utility entrance offered a way inside. Positions set, Danny whispered over the radio. We're ready when you are. Frank gave the signal. Do it. A series of explosions ripped through the front gate, sending guards scrambling. Floodlights swung wildly as sirens blared. Cartel soldiers ran toward the main entrance, unaware that Frank's team was already breaching the compound from the other side. They moved swiftly through the shadows, eliminating guards with silenced weapons. Reyes guided them to the comms tower, where technicians were trying to coordinate a response to the attack. Take them out, Frank ordered. Joanna and Travis opened fire, disabling the guards and destroying the equipment. Sparks flew as the tower's main power source overloaded, plunging parts of the compound into darkness. Just as it seemed like the attack was going according to plan, Kara's voice came through with an urgent warning. Frank, I've got bad news. I'm picking up heat signatures on the southern ridge. Reinforcements, at least 20 men with armored vehicles. They must have had a backup force stationed nearby. Of course they did, Danny muttered. They always have a contingency. Frank tightened his jaw. We need to intercept them before they can reinforce the compound. Reyes, you take half the team and hold the southern ridge. The rest of us will secure Ortega's command post. Got it, Reyes said, rallying his men. Frank watched as Reyes's team disappeared into the night. The odds were stacking against them, but there was no turning back. Frank led his team deeper into the compound, where Ortega had set up a fortified command center. The walls were reinforced, and armed guards blocked every approach. The sounds of gunfire echoed through the facility as Reyes's team engaged the reinforcements on the ridge. We need a way inside, Joanna said, ducking behind cover. Travis pointed to a nearby fuel storage area. We can use that. A couple of grenades will blow the whole side of the building open. Make it happen, Frank ordered. Moments later, a thunderous explosion rocked the compound as the fuel tanks ignited. Flames engulfed the side of Ortega's command post, forcing his guards to retreat. Frank and Joanna stormed the breach, clearing the remaining defenders. Inside, Ortega stood defiantly at the center of the room, his face grim but unafraid. You think this changes anything? He snarled. Even if you kill me, others will take my place. Frank leveled his shotgun at Ortega. You've been saying that since we met, but I don't see anyone here to save you now. You're wrong, Ortega said, his voice cold. They're already watching. This isn't just about me or this compound. You've started a war you can't win. Before Frank could respond, Ortega lunged for a hidden weapon. Joanna reacted instantly, shooting him in the leg and sending him crashing to the floor. It's over, Frank said, standing over him. You're done. With Ortega incapacitated and his forces in disarray, the remaining cartel soldiers surrendered. Reyes reported over the radio that the reinforcements had been neutralized. The safe house was in flames, its operations crippled. Danny regrouped with Frank near the command center. Well, that's one hell of a statement, he said, surveying the destruction. Frank nodded. They won't recover from this anytime soon. But Ortega was right about one thing. This isn't the end. No, Danny agreed, but it's a damn good start. Before leaving the compound, Frank sent a final transmission over the cartel's radio network. This is Frank Mitchell. You came after my land, my family, and my people. We took your operations apart piece by piece. You want revenge? Come find me. But you won't like what happens next. He cut the transmission and turned to his team. Let's go home. The convoy rolled out as dawn broke over the desert. Kodiak walked beside the trucks, his massive form silhouetted against the rising sun. The fight for the ranch had taken a heavy toll, but they had sent a message loud and clear. They wouldn't be broken. The convoy moved steadily through the dusty back roads toward the ranch. The early light of dawn stretched across the horizon, casting long shadows on the desert floor. Despite the exhaustion weighing on them, there was a shared sense of accomplishment. They had dismantled a major arm of the cartel's operation, crippled their leadership, and sent a message that echoed far beyond the borders of Dry Creek. In the lead truck, Frank drove in silence. Beside him, Danny leaned back in his seat, his adrenaline finally fading. Feels strange, doesn't it? Danny muttered. Winning. Frank chuckled softly. You call this winning? We're alive. I'd call that a win, Danny replied with a grin. Behind them, Kodiak walked near the convoy, occasionally glancing at the vehicles as if to check that everyone was still there. Joanna, riding in one of the trucks, smiled when she saw the bear pacing alongside them. Good boy, she whispered to herself. As the convoy approached the ranch, they noticed several police vehicles waiting near the entrance. Sheriff Tom Walker, a longtime friend of Frank's, stood with his arms crossed, observing the battered trucks and the wounded bikers stepping out. Well, well, Walker said as Frank climbed out of the truck. I heard rumors you were stirring up trouble, but I didn't think you'd take on an entire cartel. Frank gave a tired nod. Wasn't exactly the plan, Sheriff. Walker shook his head with a mixture of admiration and frustration. You know, you could have called me. We could have handled this through official channels. Frank smirked. They weren't interested in negotiations, and I wasn't going to wait around for red tape to clear while they tore apart my land. Walker sighed but didn't press the issue. You made a hell of a mess, Frank, but I can't deny you got results. We've got cartel prisoners in custody and reports coming in from across the border. Word's spreading fast. You've shaken the hornet's nest. Good, Frank said. Let them come. We'll be ready. As the sheriff spoke, Kara's voice came through Frank's earpiece. Frank, you might want to hear this. I intercepted another transmission from a secure line. Frank stepped away from the group, listening closely. The same deep voice from before spoke, calm and calculating. Mitchell, you've proven more troublesome than expected. But this isn't over. You've gained the attention of powerful people, and they won't forget what you've done. Watch your back. The line went dead. Frank lowered the earpiece and exhaled slowly. Whoever was behind the cartel's funding and operations had deeper connections than they had realized. Danny approached, noticing the tension in Frank's expression. What's going on? They're not done with us, Frank said quietly. They're watching. Danny shrugged. Let them watch. They know what happens when they push us. Yeah, Frank said. But this time, we'll be the ones watching them. Over the next few days, the ranch and the surrounding community began to rebuild. Locals arrived with supplies and manpower, helping to repair fences, reinforce buildings, and clean up the aftermath of the battle. Word had spread quickly about what Frank and his team had done, and the town rallied around them. You've got a lot of support now, Joanna said, watching his neighbors work to rebuild the barn. They know you stood up for all of us. Frank nodded. It's not just about the ranch anymore. We're protecting more than just land. Danny joined them, holding a cup of coffee. Feels good, doesn't it? Seeing people come together like this? Frank gave a small smile. It does. One afternoon, a group of children from the town arrived with their parents, hoping to see Kodiak. The bear had become something of a local legend after the stories of his role in the fight spread. Is that the famous bear? One boy asked excitedly. Frank chuckled. That's him. Kodiak's been with me for years. He's part of the family. Kodiak, sensing the peaceful atmosphere, lumbered over and lay down near the children, allowing them to cautiously approach. The sight brought a rare moment of warmth and hope to the ranch. You've got yourself a real hero here, one of the parents said. Yeah, Frank replied softly. He's earned it. That evening, the team gathered around a bonfire near the ranch house. Danny, Joanna, Travis, and the rest of the bikers shared stories and laughed, their bond strengthened by the battles they had fought together. Frank stood at the edge of the firelight, watching his friends and family. For the first time in a long while, he allowed himself to relax, if only for a moment. Joanna approached, holding 2 cups of coffee. She handed one to Frank. You did good, Frank. We all did. Yeah, he said, taking a sip. But it's not over. No, she agreed. But when it comes, we'll be ready. Frank nodded, his gaze fixed on the horizon. The cartel might send more men, and new enemies might rise. But Dry Creek wasn't defenseless anymore. They had each other, and they had Kodiak.